You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast is Brian Rydell. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, focusing on budget, tax, and economic policy. He previously, for 6 years, worked as chief economist to Senator Rob Portman and a staff director of the U.S. Senate Finance Subcommittee on Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth. He's also served as director of budget and spending policy of Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign and was the lead architect of the 10-year deficit reduction plan for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Buck. I'm glad to be here.
So, what I'd really like to talk about today is the new administration and the Trump economy and kind of what your thoughts on that are. And, not just the economy, but, things that are sort of peripheral to that are going to affect the economy. For example, let's talk about Donald Trump's Doge Commission, which is being led by Elon Musk, I guess. Promises to cut government spending. Realistically, what do you think the opportunity is for trimming government waste? I mean, from outside of the government world, I would think that there's quite a bit of fat probably to trim. And I'm just curious, what do you think they can accomplish?
I think there's a couple ways of approaching this question. There is, do we want Musk and Ramaswamy to do a more ideological approach of here is what fiscal conservatives want to get rid of? Do we want to get rid of the Department of Education, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor, Housing and Urban Development? This is kind of a greatest hits of what fiscal conservatives have been pushing for the last 40 years. The big stuff, the stuff that Elon Musk says, we want to save $2 trillion out of a $6.8 trillion budget. You can't get that much. But the concern that I have, even though I agree with some of those policy prescriptions, is remember that this commission doesn't have any official government power. It's a private entity that's only going to be writing a report and sending it to Congress and the White House. And the reality of it is Congress is not going to be closing down departments and getting rid of entire functions. Even the stuff we need to do on Social Security and Medicare is going to be part of a grand deal negotiation on the Hill. It's not going to come from two billionaires. But I think if they focus on the name in their title, government efficiency, there is a true opportunity there because there is waste, fraud, and abuse in the budget that has been ignored. Clearly, waste, fraud, and abuse isn't going to balance the budget. It's not half of federal spending or anything. But the GAO recently estimated that fraud and overpayments cost between $220 billion and $520 billion a year. OMB put overpayments at about $191 billion. That stuff gets ignored by Congress because they don't have the attention span to go into the weeds and fix it. If Musk and Ramaswamy come up with ways to get rid of duplication, consolidate, the 130 different economic development programs, fix overpayments, they can save couple $100 billion a year in a way that Congress would actually follow through on.
Yeah. So I'm curious though on your thoughts that they aren't going to necessarily be able to eliminate departments at a time. I mean, I think that that is probably what a lot of people are kind of hoping they do, right? What are the powers that be that are going to prevent that? I mean, obviously, Congress it is a Republican Congress. I guess what are the motivations not to potentially eliminate some of these departments or large parts of departments? I mean, is it special interests? Is it, what do you think the major forces are that would prevent those major shifts?
The issue is, and I've been doing this for 40 years. I've been following this stuff for 40 years. I've been working in Washington on it for about a quarter of a century. So I've been through the wars. The challenge is a lot of these eliminations and spending cuts are popular in the abstract until people see the specifics. For instance, the Department of Education, getting rid of the Department of Education is really popular with about a quarter of the electorate. And it's really only about a quarter. It's about half of the GOP is really excited about getting rid of the Department of Education until they find out often that we would be terminating Pell Grants completely. We would be completely eliminating student loans. We would be eliminating funding for the disadvantaged students and funding for poor school districts. And we would be ending any sort of power of the federal government to do anything. When people hear that, usually the opposition takes up and said, well, okay, we can't get rid of student loans. And of course, we don't want to really defund all the disabled kids.
Right.
Or for instance, you hear Department of Labor. What the hell do we need a Department of Labor for? They run the uninsurance employment system.
Yeah.
The unemployment insurance system. Okay, well, I don't know if we want to get rid of that. So what ends up happening is even the Gingrich 104th Congress could not eliminate a federal department. The Tea Party Congress could not eliminate a federal department. The Trump 2017-2018 full control of government never came close because once you get specific, there's such a voter backlash that even conservative lawmakers back down. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't get rid of some of the departments.
Yeah.
I'm saying I've been pushing it for 25 years.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah. And then the challenge on top of that is, I mean, you mentioned entitlements, but the reality is, I mean, now you're talking about taking things away from people and,
Yep.
there's not even going to there's no political will for that. I mean, people are standing out there saying, keep your government hands off my Medicare, and that kind of thing. I mean, do you even think that there's a possibility within entitlements that they can actually do anything, or that they would even want to do anything because of the political backlash they may face?
Again, I've been working on entitlement reform in Washington for 25 years. I was one of the negotiators during the Obama administration with the Republican Congress. I was one of the Republican negotiators. There is no appetite whatsoever on Capitol Hill to do any Social Security and Medicare reforms. There are some back channel bipartisan conversations happening that I've been fortunate to be a part of and advise. But at this point, the Democrats say we're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare. Trump says we're not going to touch Social Security and Medicare. Nothing two billionaires write is going to bring the two parties together to do that. Ultimately, though, I will say, if you want to fix the budget, ultimately there's three levers to truly stabilize the debt: Social Security, Medicare, and middle-class taxes. And I say that because everything else that people talk about, tax the rich, defense, waste, welfare, none of it comes close. You have to either do Social Security, Medicare, and or middle-class taxes, depending on what flavor
what do you mean?
prefer.
So tax the middle class, or
Yeah.
what do you mean? Yeah.
Yes, because the budget deficit under a current policy baseline, current policy means let's assume that we keep the tax cuts and we keep all current benefits, goes to 14% of GDP over the next 30 years. You need about a 3% of GDP deficit to keep the debt stable. It's going to go to 14. You can't tax the rich enough to close 14% of GDP. In fact, I did a report a year ago called The Limits of Taxing the Rich, where I determined that if you set every upper income and corporate tax policy at its revenue maximizing rate without any regard for the economy, you could raise 1.5% of GDP in new revenues. You're going to have to go to the middle class. And on the spending side, all the money is going to Social Security and Medicare.
Yeah, I mean, net, it's ultimately because there's just not enough rich people, right? I mean, they're
exactly. There's
right.
Let me put it this way: there's 800 billionaires in America. They own $4.8 trillion of total wealth. If you seized every penny of their wealth, every house, every car, every jet, all the way down to their kids' toys, and you sold them for full value, you could fund the government one time for 8 months. and then it's gone forever.
Yeah.
You can't get there from taxing the rich. The revenue is in middle class taxes, unfortunately, and on the spending side, the spending is going to Social Security and Medicare.
So two things we know that are certainly not going to happen is effectively the one thing, though, going back to you mentioned, they could potentially make things more efficient and maybe save a couple $100 billion a year. I mean, does that do anything? I mean, honestly, a couple $100 billion. I mean, these numbers are so big.
Marginal.
I have no idea.
The deficit this year is 1.8 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
The current policy baseline is that it will go to $3.8 trillion in a decade, and even that assumes interest rates stay low. You can get a couple $100 billion a year out of an aggressive waste push. It's helpful. It's helpful to the extent that every dollar you cut from waste is $1 less that you have to raise taxes or cut Social Security or Medicare. And in that way, I think we owe it to the voters to at least do what we can on the low-hanging fruit before we do the bigger stuff. But ultimately, the reason we have deficits growing long-term is because of the benefits we vote for ourselves. It's not all bureaucracy and waste.
Yeah. Speaking of which, obviously, all of us in Wealth Formula, our community probably benefits significantly from Trump's, his Trump tax policies that are probably headed our way. And so at a personal level, we're all, we're probably pretty eager to see what happens there. But what impact does that really have on debt and inflation? Are you worried about it?
Yeah. The Trump tax cuts are, if we continue them, the continued cost is about $300 to $400 billion a year plus interest. Sure, there's some supply side effect where you're going to get a little bit of growth, you're going to get some of that back, but it's about $300 to $400 billion a year. So when you look at a deficit of 1.8 trillion going to 3.8 trillion, it's not close to the main driver of deficits. The main driver is Social Security and Medicare. But, again, $300 to $400 billion a year matters. In terms of inflation, the tax cuts themselves are not that inflationary. The concern is the inflationary combination of tariffs, mass deportations, tax cuts, spending, and wanting to take control of the Federal Reserve. Every one of those is inflationary to some degree. You put all that together, watch out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know what the likelihood of taking control of the Federal Reserve. What's really possible on that end? I mean, and then Jerome Powell's got another year, I think, and he's not resigning. Is it a matter of can Trump just put in somebody who just does what he wants him to do? Is that kind of the idea with taking over?
Statutorily, he's limited because the Federal Open Market Committee, you have to wait until their term expires, which happens about every year or two, one of the members, and then you have to get the new person Senate confirmed. Powell, you have another year or two, and the replacement would have to be Senate confirmed. But the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee works broadly by consensus. There's not much he can do without an act of Congress to weaken the Fed directly. And like I said, even his Federal Reserve nominees have to be confirmed by the Senate. One thing, though, the president can do that has been effective in the past is put public pressure on the Fed. We've seen this in the past. We saw this with Nixon. We saw this after World War II, where presidents put intense pressure on the Federal Reserve. And the people in the Fed are human. And there have been definite cases in the past where the White House leans on the Fed, so they ease off the brake a little bit and inflation starts to grow. And that's part of how we got the 1970s. So there is pressure the White House can exert. And we know Trump is not shy about using that pressure.
Let's talk about tariffs because, excuse me, it was a big topic during the election, coming up to the election. A lot of people worried about the effects of tariffs as an inflationary stimulus. In your opinion, I mean, just from what you've seen, I mean, do you think that Trump is using tariffs more as leverage or sort of a bargaining chip, a threat, than he's actually willing to implement it? I mean, I'm not asking to read his mind, but I guess,
Yeah.
I'm curious what you, from your end, policy thinkers, think about like the real threat. I mean, he's got some smart people around him too, and he's a money guy. He's got to know. He also doesn't want to crank up inflation. So, what's your read on that?
Yeah, I think I would start by saying I think during the campaign and possibly up to right now, Trump was absolutely serious that he was not bluffing. And Trump would argue in every speech, I am not bluffing, I am serious. And advisors to Trump were very sure to say he's serious. Additionally, Trump has sent word to Capitol Hill that he is okay with Republicans voting on the tariffs and putting them in statute rather than just having Trump appoint them or, do them by executive order. Well, if you're just bluffing or want flexibility, you don't put that in statute. Statute is firm. You can't change it without another statute. That being said, Trump is already getting pushback internally from his advisors and his potential nominees. And in particular, he is having trouble finding a Treasury secretary, in part because he wants someone who will embrace the tariffs. But in his conversations, I've been told, he's very nervous about stock market effects. He's very nervous about how tariffs would affect the S&P. And he told some of his advisors to make sure the tariffs cause the stock market to go up and not down. Well, clearly, that's highly unlikely. So you're starting to see some cracks that might make this again become more of a threat. Even if on the campaign he was serious, he's getting a little, and you see Walmart yesterday saying if the tariffs happen, prices are going way up.
Sure.
Now it's becoming real. And interest rate effects are real. I think we might see some cracks in his firmness on this.
What's your take on some of the other policies in terms of? I mean, they're not going to affect our group very much, but no tax on tips, overtime pay, these kinds of things. Like, what is he suggesting? And is there any real downside to any? I mean, I would think the implications of the economy would be pretty minimal. I mean,
the effect is, well, as an economist, I think these are terrible proposals. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security benefits, because they muck up the tax code. They treat people of similar incomes differently, and they lower revenues. And the thing about revenues is, if you want to cut taxes and you want to do it, there's a better way to do it than just adding these carve outs. Like, if you really want to set revenues at 16% of GDP, for instance, there's a much more efficient pro-growth way of doing it than just willy-nilly carve outs that don't make much sense, can be gamed. And I will just make the budget argument as well. I mean, again, we have deficits going to nearly $4 trillion. I don't understand how, if you do this, again, we're kind of barreling towards a debt crisis here.
And what is it? What does a debt crisis really look? I mean, I know this may seem like a very simplistic question, but what is a debt crisis? I mean, we talk about this all. We're worried about the debt all the time. Realistically, what does a debt crisis in the United States really look like? I mean, it's not it's not like some of the Latin countries and things like that you see. It's not Greece, but what does it look like in the United States?
Yeah, well, some background on this is Social Security and Medicare face a cash shortfall of $120 trillion over the next 30 years. The current baseline deficit is $170 trillion. So over 30 years, the debt is projected, just keeping the current government from going from 30 trillion to 200 trillion. Now, the economy is going to get bigger, but if interest rates rise, I mean, you're looking at a debt going from 100% of GDP today to as much as 300% of GDP. The problem there, who's going to supply the lending for a $200 trillion debt. China and Japan only hold $1 trillion each, and they're trying to get rid of it.
Right.
The Fed holds about $5-6 trillion. They're trying to get rid of it, and they don't want to run the printing press and monetize by buying the bonds. So you're looking at borrowing $150, $170 trillion from domestic savings markets. I'm not sure that can happen without interest rates notably rising from the low levels there are projected, and without drawing that money away from investment. So what does a debt crisis look like? It looks like the bond market crying uncle at a certain point. And at a certain point, and we're already seeing little indications of this, the bond market says we cannot supply this much lending to the government at current interest rates. There's going to be a default premium priced in. There's going to be a simple supply and demand. And what happens is interest rates go up, then they have to borrow more, which pushes interest rates up even more. And when it spirals, that's when the market starts to tank. That's the debt crisis that America, I think, faces. And it may not be one giant cataclysmic event. I think it might be a series of minor crises where the bond market panics. We do some modest tax hikes and spending cuts, but ultimately it's not enough. So there's a little panic again. And then we do a little harder tax hikes and spending cuts, but that only gets us a couple more years. It might be a series of mini panics where at the end of it, you have the same tax system as Europe.
Yeah. And you can't print yourself out of that.
Not $200 trillion, not unless you want hyperinflation. There's just way too much. You can't do it. It's too big.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, that's really helpful because it's sometimes you just, you hear about the debt crisis, and I think trying to understand what that actually implies. Basically, what you're saying is,
I think it's the bond market. The bond market shrugs.
Yeah. So high interest rates, and basically high taxation, because otherwise you're talking about hyperinflation.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
It's just, you just have the bond market interest rates going up, the market panicking, inflation going up, and eventually Congress has to just raise taxes and cut spending.
Trump talks a lot about stimulating economic growth through energy policy. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that? I mean, is that a real? Is that something that you think that is realistic?
I think it is. There's actually some good things going on right now in energy. In terms of some renewables, natural gas, fracking, of course, became kind of a central issue during the campaign. There's a lot of energy that can be unleashed, both fossil and more renewable energy. The question is how to encourage it. And we've pretty much pushed as far as we can in the tax code. We have given so many tax incentives on energy. And ultimately, a lot of Republicans actually want to push back on a lot of the clean energy parts that were enacted during the Inflation Reduction Act, because some of those were seen as more wasteful giveaways, such as the electric vehicle subsidies. Ultimately, though, energy markets are extraordinarily important on inflation and long-term economic growth. We saw in Europe, a lot of the post-pandemic inflation in Europe was driven by energy markets, particularly the chaos after Russia-Ukraine. I don't have a great feel on whether Trump can actually do much there, except possibly get out of the way, which is, you could say, better than Biden in many instances. I think the government simply getting out of the way and allowing easier permitting, more exploration, and encouraging an all of the above strategy can improve.
Well, I think uranium or just in general, nuclear energy would also be part of that. It seems like there's a lot of pressure, not only from, what we talked about with just general energy, but also with AI and the needs for energy. It just seems like that is very likely to be something that becomes a bigger player. Do you think that's true?
I think so. Again, I think we need all of the above. And I've always been a big supporter of nuclear. It's one of those areas where Europe has run circles around us. And frankly, they shouldn't be. I mean, ultimately, I think over time, we may end up in a better place with solar and wind. I was a critic of solar and wind for a long time, but the cost truly is coming down. But, nuclear has to be part of the equation too. And, it's been so long since we built nuclear power plants in America because the government has essentially made it impossible to do so.
Yeah.
So again, these are areas where the government just kind of getting out of the way can go a long way.
I guess we'll talk a little bit. We've talked about this a little bit before, but, as an economist who's worked inside of Congress yourself before, what kind of support do you think Trump will have with both chambers to, overall for his economic goals? I mean, you look at the situation, you've got, a Republican president who, who's by all measures, I think would look like he's got a national mandate. I mean, won the popular vote. He really, pretty much won a landslide electoral vote. You've got both chambers that are Republican. Do you think that there's going to be a ton of resistance to him? And because, it's an interesting thing because this president has a lot of muscle power. I mean, literally kind of people are afraid of him in the chamber.
Yeah.
So I'm curious on that.
Yeah. I mean, and this is something I spend a lot of time on because I'm on Capitol Hill talking to lawmakers and staff frequently. I'm in meetings with these lawmakers. I used to work with a lot of them. I worked in the Senate for 6 years. Republican members of Congress are personally quite critical of Trump's economic agenda. Most of them do not like the tariffs. They wish we could do more on real spending restraint, such as Social Security and Medicare, and kind of focus on that kind of stuff that Trump says don't touch. They're very resistant on doing anything, to try to question the independence of the Federal Reserve. And they think that some of Trump's tax reforms, beyond just extending the tax cuts, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, are excessive. All that being said, they won't say that in public.
Yeah, sure.
And realistically, they're going to vote for a lot of this stuff. I mean, these members, I've been in meetings with members who say this Trump policy is, this is just Democratic big government stuff. And then the next day I see them on TV saying, we believe in President Trump and we look forward to giving him what he wants. So this is one area where I think the congressional Republicans are much more traditional free market conservatives than the White House. But they also know they know how to read election results. They know where their base is. They know how the Republican electorate is evolving on these issues. And a lot of them are just going to go along with it.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I guess the last question I'll ask you is this, is that, over the years, even within the last, I'd say, certainly in the last 15 years, there's been a huge change in the Republican Party in general. I mean, there really is. I don't know that either party now represents a fiscally conservative party. Just your comments on that and the implications of that.
This hurts me because I'm a fiscal conservative.
Yeah.
And I was a close friend of Paul Ryan. We're both from Wisconsin. I knew him before he ever ran for office. And Paul Ryan took charge and said, we're going to fix Social Security and Medicare. And he started charging up the hill and he looked behind him and there was no army behind him.
Yeah.
There was a poll done after Trump got elected that said only 10% of Republicans are willing to do Social Security and Medicare reform. Not Democrats, only 10% of Republicans. Right. And what Trump did was he pulled that out. He brought that to the surface. And then he also made the Republican Party older and more working class than it had been. So you take a group of voters that were already skeptical on a lot of this fiscal conservative stuff, and then you add working class and older people to the coalition. Today's Republican Party is not economically conservative. It is economically populist. It is very comfortable with big government. It's very comfortable with safety net social insurance, particularly middle class benefits. It likes tariffs. It's skeptical of big business. We see Josh Hawley and JD Vance, always criticizing big business. We're really left without a free market party. The Democrats are kind of a big government progressive technocrat party.
Mm-hmm.
And the Republicans are a more European populist social benefits and kind of, anti-foreign a bit party. But it's just two different flavors of big government. The traditional free market, cut spending, free trade, we're extinct.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Maybe it'll come back. It seems to me that these kinds of things kind of are cyclical, right? So
I hope,
yeah.
because I'm an orphan these days. No one listens to me.
Well, Brian, how can people learn more about, things that your work in general?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Brian_Riedel, RIEDL. You can also Google my name and Manhattan Institute. I have all sorts of reports. In fact, I have a new chart book, 136 pages of charts on government spending, taxes, and deficits. So if you search my name and find chart book, you can see 136 pages of charts. So I would go Twitter, Manhattan Institute, any of that, just Google it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.